In the early spring of 1922, a small farmstead nestled in the remote woods of Bavaria, Germany, became the stage for one of the most gruesome and perplexing unsolved crimes in history. The place was called Hinterkaifeck, a name that would soon echo with dread. About 70 kilometers north of Munich, the farm sat isolated, surrounded by dense forest, far from the bustle of any town. The nearest village, Kaifeck, was half a mile away, and even that felt like a world apart. The farm belonged to the Gruber family, a group known for keeping to themselves, their lives a quiet rhythm of hard work and solitude. But beneath that stillness, something sinister had been brewing for weeks. The Gruber family consisted of Andreas Gruber, a stern 63-year-old farmer with a grizzled face and a temper that kept neighbors at a distance, his wife Cecilia, 72, a frail woman whose years of labor had bent her back, their widowed daughter Victoria, Gabrielle, 35, a somber beauty with a voice that lifted the church choir, Victoria's two children, little Cecilia, a bright-eyed 7-year-old, and Joseph, a cherubic 2-year-old who still slept in a bassinet. And finally, Maria Baumgartner, 44-year-old maid, who had arrived at the farm just hours before the nightmare unfolded. The family had a reputation for being reclusive, their interactions with the outside world limited to what was necessary. Rumors swirled about Andreas's harsh ways, whispers of abuse and darker secrets, but no one dared to pry too closely. For weeks before the murders, strange things had been happening at Hinterkaifeck. It started with the previous maid, Crescence Rieger, who fled the farm 6 months earlier, swearing the place was haunted. She claimed to hear footsteps in the attic at night, soft thuds that echoed through the wooden beams above her bed. She felt watched, she said, as though unseen eyes followed her every move. Andreas had scoffed at her fears, calling her superstitious, but after she left, the unease lingered like a shadow over the farm. Then, in early March, Andreas found something unsettling. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest straight to the farm's machine room. The snow around the door was disturbed, the lock broken, but there were no tracks leading away. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had come had never left. A few days later, Andreas stumbled across a newspaper on the property, a Munich publication he didn't recognize and certainly hadn't bought. He asked around. No one in the nearby villages subscribed to it either. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Then the family's house keys went missing, one set vanishing without a trace. At night, they began to hear noises, creaks and thumps from the attic, faint but persistent. Andreas climbed up to check, lantern in hand, but found nothing. He told neighbors about these odd occurrences, his gruff voice tinged with unease, but he refused their offers of help and never reported anything to the police. Perhaps he thought he could handle it himself, perhaps he feared what he might uncover. On the afternoon of March 31, 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck, her sister escorting her to the farm. Maria was a sturdy woman, eager for work, her hands already calloused from years of labor. She had only just unpacked her few belongings when her sister left, the two exchanging a quick goodbye. It was the last time anyone outside the farm saw the family alive. The evening settled in, cold and quiet, the kind of night where the darkness feels heavier than usual. Inside the farmhouse, the family went about their routines. Victoria tucked little Josef into his bassinet in her room, his tiny fingers clutching a rag doll. Cecilia sat by the fire, her small frame curled into a chair, while Andreas smoked his pipe, the faint glow of embers lighting his weathered face. Maria settled into her small room off the kitchen, the straw mattress creaking under her weight. No one knows exactly how it began, but investigators later pieced together a chilling sequence of events. Sometime after nightfall, someone or something lured the family to the barn, one by one. First went Andreas, perhaps drawn by a sound, a faint knock, or the lowing of a cow. The barn was a short walk from the house, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the air inside thick with the smell of hay and livestock. He stepped inside, his lantern casting long shadows across the straw-strewn floor. Before he could react, a heavy blow struck his head, the force shattering his skull. Blood sprayed across the hay, his body crumpling to the ground, lifeless before he could even cry out. Next came Cecilia, the elder, perhaps worried when her husband didn't return. She shuffled to the barn, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, calling his name softly. The same fate awaited her. A mattock, a pickaxe-like tool used for breaking hard soil, slammed into her head, cracking it open like an eggshell. She fell beside Andreas, her blood mingling with his in the dirt, her face frozen in a silent scream. Victoria was the third, likely drawn by the absence of her parents. She stepped into the barn, her breath catching at the sight of their bodies, but before she could scream, the weapon struck again, smashing her skull with such force that investigators later found 9 star-shaped wounds on her head. Her face was battered beyond recognition, her once beautiful features reduced to pulp. Little Kazelia, the 7-year-old, was the last to be lured to the barn. Perhaps she woke up, saw the empty house, and went looking for her mother. The killer was waiting. The mattock crashed into her head, shattering her jaw and slashing her neck, but it didn't kill her instantly. She fell to the ground, trapped beneath the weight of her family's bodies, her small hands clawing at her own hair in agony. For hours she lay there, her life slipping away slowly, her whimpers fading into the cold night air. With the barn a scene of carnage, the killer moved back to the house. Maria Baumgartner was still in her room, perhaps asleep, perhaps stirring at some faint noise. The door creaked open, and before she could scream, the mattock struck, blows raining down on her head in a frenzy. Her skull cracked, blood soaking into the straw mattress, her body slumping lifeless beneath the thin sheet. Finally, the killer turned to little Joseph, still asleep in his bassinet. A single heavy blow to his tiny face ended his life, the force so brutal it nearly cleaved his head in two. His small body lay still, the rag doll slipping from his grasp, stained red with his blood. What happened next is perhaps the most chilling part of all. The killer didn't flee. For 3 days they stayed at Hinterkaifeck, living among the dead. They ate the family's food, slicing bread and cheese with the same hands that had wielded the mattock. They fed the animals, the cows and pigs none the wiser, their lowing and grunting filling the eerie silence. They lit fires in the hearth, the smoke curling lazily from the chimney, a cruel mockery of normalcy. Neighbors saw the smoke, heard the animals, and thought nothing of it. The family was reclusive, after all. Why would anyone suspect? It wasn't until April 4 that the truth came to light. Young Kazelia hadn't shown up for school, and the family missed church on Sunday, a rare absence for Victoria, who sang in the choir. Mail began to pile up at the post office. Concerned neighbors, led by Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a farmer who had once been close to Victoria, decided to check on them. They approached the farm, the air heavy with an unspoken dread. The front door was locked, the windows dark. They made their way to the barn, the door slightly ajar, and stepped inside. The sight that greeted them was beyond horror. 4 bodies lay stacked in the hay. Andreas, Kazelia, Victoria, and little Kazelia, covered loosely with straw, their blood soaking into the earth. Andreas's face was shredded, his cheekbones protruding through ragged flesh. The elder Kazelia's skull was cracked open, signs of strangulation marking her throat. Victoria's head was a mess of shattered bone and torn skin. And little Kazelia, she had died slowly, her small hands clutching clumps of her own hair, torn out in her final moments of torment. The neighbors stumbled back, their stomachs churning, and made their way to the house. Inside, they found Maria in her room, her body covered with a sheet, her head caved in from multiple blows. In Victoria's room, little Joseph lay in his bassinet, his tiny face destroyed, a dress draped over him as if to shield the sight. The air was thick with the stench of death, the walls stained with streaks of blood. The neighbors fled, their screams echoing through the woods as they ran to fetch the authorities. The Munich police arrived, but the investigation was a mess from the start. Dozens of villagers had already trampled through the crime scene, moving bodies, touching objects, even cooking meals in the kitchen before the police could secure it. Evidence was lost, contaminated, or overlooked. The murder weapon, a mattock belonging to the farm, was later found hidden in the attic, its blade crusted with dried blood. A penknife, too, was discovered buried in the hay, its blade stained red. But no clear fingerprints, no definitive clues to the killer's identity. Theories abounded. Some pointed to Lawrence Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who led the search party. He had a past with Victoria, and some whispered he might have been Joseph's father. But he had an alibi, and no solid evidence tied him to the crime. Others suspected vagrants or traveling criminals, but nothing was stolen, not even the large sum of money found in the house. Some even speculated about darker motives. Whispers of incest and family secrets, but nothing concrete emerged. The police interviewed dozens of suspects over the years, but no one was ever charged. The case grew cold. The farm was demolished less than a year later, and a small concrete memorial was erected in its place, a silent tribute to the lost. But the horror didn't end with the discovery. During the autopsies, performed by court physician Johann Baptist Oemmeler, a chilling detail came to light. Little Kazelia, the 7-year-old, had survived for hours after the attack, trapped beneath her family's bodies in the barn. Her skull was shattered, her jaw broken, her neck slashed, but she had clung to life, tearing at her own hair in agony as she bled out in the dark. The thought of her suffering, alone and terrified, haunted investigators and villagers alike. And then there were the stories that surfaced after. Neighbors claimed to have seen a shadowy figure lurking in the woods in the days before the murders, a man with no face, just a blur in the twilight. Others swore they heard strange noises from the forest at night, low guttural moans that weren't quite human. The animals had been fed, the fires lit. Whoever stayed in that house for 3 days had moved through it like a ghost, untouched by the carnage they'd wrought. Some began to whisper that Hinterkaifeck wasn't just the site of a murder, but something worse, something evil. The farm is gone now, razed to the ground as if to erase the memory of what happened, but the memory persists, a wound that refuses to heal. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved, a century-old mystery that still chills the blood. And in the woods where the farm once stood, some say the shadows move at night, restless and hungry, as though the darkness that came for the Grubers never truly left.